August 5, 1994 went down in Cuban history as the Maleconazo. For the first time since the triumph of the revolution, thousands of Cubans took to the streets in a spontaneous protest against the Castro regime. News of the Maleconazo spread like wildfire across media outlets around the world, despite Havana's tight control on information.
There was this major disturbance there in Havana, so the Herald said, hey, we're going to send you to Cuba. So the next day, I was in Havana to cover the events. But by the time I got there, everything calmed down.
Everyone was out on the street, shouting. People were screaming from their balconies, everyone. The mood was really agitated, and I knew that people needed to find a way out somehow.
The last time people were allowed to leave was 14 years earlier, during the Mariel Boatlift in 1980, when more than 125,000 Cubans fled the island. On July 13, 1994, about 7 miles out of Havana Harbor, Cuban government boats intercepted and sank a tugboat named 13 de Marzo. On board, a group of Cubans who had hijacked the boat in an attempt to flee. Some 39 people were killed in the incident. Many analysts agreed that this was the last drop in a sea of desperation caused by a shortage of food and staples during the so-called Special Period, a legacy left by the collapse of the former Soviet Union, Cuba's longtime communist sponsor.
You'd go to the store and people would complain because there was no merchandise. People were tired of so many years of prohibition without seeing any results. So really, it was almost an unsustainable situation.
But the worst was yet to come.
One night, in the middle of the night, someone came over to me and told me there were balseros leaving from Cojiman. I hopped on a 57 Chevy, got a driver to take me over there, and saw people in the water, but it was very dark, and I could see the figures.
The government smartly said, whoever wants to leave can go. So then what happens? People see another opportunity to escape.
Sunrise the following day would shed light on a scene never witnessed before. The lack of access to wood and waterproof materials sparks a creativity among those seeking to flee.
Looking for work, money, dollars.
Scenes like this would be repeated on many stretches of land along the seashore.
By the end of the day, I was like amazed because there were people on the streets and carrying inner tubes and like nothing, walking in the streets. And I always heard this was, you just don't do that out in the open.
Everybody into Key West.
On August 15th, the U.S. Coast Guard begins to break records in the number of Cuban rafters rescued at sea. 282 in a single day. 4 days later, on the 19th, another record is set, 745. During the journey, death was always a lurking companion.
Many would arrive with missing limbs. They had lost their legs during the journey. One woman traveled sitting on the edge of a raft with her leg in the water, and a shark came and bit it off.
I would see people get on the rafts, launch into the water, fail, and then try again.
There was a day when 200 people left, and none ever arrived.
There's no hopes that would stay together once they hit the ocean. And you can see them, praying to the heavens.
Arturo Cobo's relationship with these Cuban seafarers began during the 1980 Mariel Boatlift. He was the founder of the Transit Center for Cuban Refugees in Key West, and the stories from this former Bay of Pigs veteran are countless.
The father died in the raft, and they left his cadaver aboard. But there came a moment when the smell was too strong, so they got a rope, threw the father's body in the ocean, and then a wave of sharks approached and devoured the father's cadaver. And there they were trying to pull him back in, but they couldn't.
We saw a lot of empty rafts, especially at night. You'd see a bulge floating nearby, and as it got closer, you'd have to push it away with the oars. They were empty rafts.
I have ordered that illegal refugees from Cuba will not be allowed to enter the United States.
The situation becomes critical. President Bill Clinton announces that those fleeing Cuba would be intercepted at sea and sent to the U.S. naval base in Guantanamo.
government of Cuba has resorted.
Janet Reno, Attorney General at the time, officially endorses the president's order. On August 24th, then Secretary of Defense William Perry announces the expansion of the detention camps in Guantanamo with a capacity to house as many as 40,000 refugees.
When we arrived at Guantanamo, the first words we heard, which were repeated every 5 minutes, was to say that the President of the United States, Bill Clinton, by presidential decree, guarantees that you will never enter American territory.
Guantanamo proves to be too small to handle the influx, and Washington seeks international help. Panama responds, and several thousand are transferred temporarily to that country. Pedro Fournier was among those who went to Panama.
I stayed in Panama for about 3 months and 20 days.
The warmth of the exile community is also felt on Panamanian soil. During this period, the help from Brothers to the Rescue, with Jose Basulto at its helm, is key in finding rafters in the Florida Straits and provide them with water and food while they waited for Coast Guard cutters to pluck them out of the high seas.
Van a haber aún más balsas todavía.
The stay at the naval base stretches for more than a year. With no immigration status for the Rafters, pressure from the exile community reaches as high as the White House. The political battle is led by the late Jorge Mascanosa, head of the Cuban American National Foundation. Finally, on May 2, 1995, Washington announces that most of the Cuban detainees in Guantanamo would be allowed to come to the United States. And in a deal reached with Cuba to stem the flow of illegal departures, Washington agrees to issue 20,000 visas a year.
Much misconception I have discovered about the Cuban Adjustment Act.
About 500 rafters with criminal records or physical or mental problems are sent back home. But how many Cubans over half a century never achieved their goal?
Esa es la causa.
That is the exodus that caused the most deaths. More than 60,000 Cubans have died in the Florida Straits in search of freedom. They never made it here.
In retrospect, 20 years later, to celebrate those of us who were rafters, I would rather celebrate that every country would have the determination that we had. We had to build a raft, risk our lives, overcome many struggles to get here. I would want that for all of this. For my nieces in Cuba, the youth growing up in Cuba or any other Latin American country, that they could have the same opportunities that I got after arriving here, but that those opportunities happen in their own countries. After 20 years, that is what I've learned. How wonderful it is to live in liberty.
Libertad, basta ya de injusticia y maldad. Libertad, libertad, Cuba clama y reclama libertad.